Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another Holy Week meditation for today, Tuesday, April the 7th. Looking forward to spending some time with you talking about some preparations and context for Easter, preparing our hearts to really love and worship our Savior this weekend for his resurrection and his death on the cross. And going to be doing a series of talks this week to kind of prepare our hearts for that. And looking forward to still doing Easter week, even though all this craziness is happening and we're still so separated from each other by this coronavirus crisis. But so glad that you're here. I hope yesterday was helpful. If you missed yesterday, you may want to go back at some point and listen to kind of get caught up to speed so that you know exactly what we've been talking about. But yesterday what I did is I talked about chapters 21, 22, and 23. And in those three chapters, we start with triumphal entry in Matthew 21, and we go through a series of events in the first few days of Holy Week for Jesus, where he enters into Jerusalem as dramatically as you possibly can, with the explicit statements that he's the son of David, and using all kinds of Old Testament language to signal to the people that he is claiming that he is the Messiah they've been looking for. I mean, this is as dramatic an entrance as you possibly could make. And from there, what does he do? He immediately goes to the temple. He finds corruption and he finds robbery and thievery going on there, led by the religious leaders, and he chases everybody out of the temple, cleanses the temple, and then gets into a two-chapter battle with the religious leaders. And this is Jesus on the attack. This is Jesus coming at guys and saying, look, people of Jerusalem, people of Israel, pilgrims, Jewish pilgrims from all over the Roman Empire, you have got to make a choice. You have to choose between the status quo of the religious leaders that have been leading you through the temple worship up till this point, or now are you going to follow me? And yes, I'm a country bumpkin preacher, Messiah, rogue Messiah from the northern part of the country, but I am the one you need to be following. And there's this conflict, and they struggle. And for two chapters, Jesus is as fierce and feisty as we've ever seen him in the Gospels. And instead of taking the intensity and kind of calming it down like he often does earlier in the Gospels, he's ramping up the conflict. He's really bringing into sharp relief the difference between his teachings and as God has revealed to him and the understanding of the law that the religious leaders have that they're now enforcing on everybody else. And in chapter 23, Jesus concludes his summary by saying, you religious leaders are under the judgment and condemnation of God. For all of these reasons, for your hypocrisy, for the fact that you ignore the most important parts of the law to focus on the minutia, the fact that you get in people's way and put heavy burdens on their shoulders and you don't help them to carry them. You have taken the law so far from what it was intended to do. You are bankrupt leaders morally. And I'm here to offer the people another way. But sadly, we come to the end of chapter 23, and this is a famous, there's a church that's built on the Mount of Olives that's actually the word is escaping me. The top of the church is shaped like a teardrop because it's the place where Jesus cried and wept as he looked on the city of Jerusalem and the people in Jerusalem, because he realized at the end of those 2 or 3 days that the people are not ready to accept him as their king, as their Messiah. Sure, they cheered for him as he marched his way in, but a couple days have gone by and the status quo continues. And Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and slay those who have been sent unto you. He says, how often I wanted to gather you together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings to protect them. He says, but you were not willing. The first phase that we talked about yesterday of Holy Week ends with disappointment. It ends with Jesus dealing with the fact that he has been rejected by the people. And because of that, the only thing that's left on the horizon in the days to come is the cross, which is a very sobering thing. It's a very sobering thing to have to contemplate. And that if that's all you have to look forward to, that's a pretty intense kind of a thing. So then we come to chapter 24. And in chapter 24, we see a very dramatic shift once again. So there's a dramatic shift with the triumphal entry where Jesus goes from being sort of like keeping things under wraps and out of the limelight as much as possible in his first 2 or 3 years of ministry. He comes into Jerusalem, the trumpets are blaring, the people are crying, the palm branches are waving. He is being very blunt about his desire to be seen as the Messiah. And then when he's rejected at about day 2 or 3 of Holy Week, he shifts into a very different mood. It's much more somber. It's much more serious. Everything from here in this moment to his betrayal and arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane in a few days on on Thursday night, all the events are now going to be private conversations and interactions between him and his disciples. So chapters 21, 22, and 23, Jesus is hanging out with the crowds. He's arguing with his enemies. He's in public, full display for everybody to see. As soon as that is rejected at the end of chapter 23, he shifts into now conversations with just his disciples. He only talks to people who are already convinced. He's given up trying to convince the masses that he is who he claims he is, and now he's focusing his attention on preparing himself and, very important, preparing his disciples for his imminent coming crucifixion. So the whole scene in chapters 24 through 26 take this really kind of more serious, somber, sober perspective. And Jesus processing his rejection by the people, and he's contemplating the cross, and he's trying to prepare his disciples for this to happen. So you notice in chapter 24, and if you're following along in your copy of the Bible, as I encourage you to, you'll notice immediately after he tells everybody and he weeps over Jerusalem and how they've rejected him, it says in the very same moment, verse 1 of chapter 24, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Now, what's going on there? You got to understand this. Jesus and his disciples are not from Jerusalem. They don't go to Jerusalem all the time. They're not as used to the buildings as the people who live in Jerusalem are. They're country bumpkins from the north who are going to the big city for this festival. Many of them, this may be the very first time they've ever been to Jerusalem, or maybe only the second or the third time. They're not as familiar with the temple and the big building and the beautiful architecture as they were. So they're like tourists, you know. If they had their little Nikon cameras, they'd be there like, Jesus, look at the temple. Wow, isn't that amazing? It's so beautiful, blah, blah, blah. They're really impressed with the temple. Just like you would be if you went to any major city in the world. You went to Paris and you saw the Eiffel Tower, or you went to Paris and saw the Louvre for the first time, or the Arc de Triomphe or whatever. You would be impressed. These guys are impressed. They're kind of like starry-eyed about the temple because everybody at that time put their hope in the fact that the temple was there. The temple was the way to be good with God. And notice how Jesus responds, verse 2. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not?" Of course, they just pointed it out to him. "Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." What Jesus is saying is that now that the people have officially rejected him from being their king, the only thing that is awaiting the temple and the people of Jerusalem at this point is judgment. It's judgment. And this judgment, which was perhaps avoidable if they had have responded to him in the right way when he marches in on the back of that colt, judgment is inescapable. It's inevitable. Judgment is going to come. The temple that they take their pride in, that they put their hope in, is going to be destroyed and pulled apart brick by brick, stone by stone. As you can imagine, the disciples are just like, what? The temple? That would be like us if we found out that somebody pointed to the Statue of Liberty and said, you know what? By this time next week, the Statue of Liberty is going to be pulled apart piece by piece. You'd probably blink a little bit and be like, the statue, what? This is like a symbol of American values and who we are as a country. How could that ever happen? And they're feeling the same way about the temple. How could you say the temple will be destroyed? That's God's house. That's where God lives. That's where the worship of God goes on. And so Jesus now launches into a description of all the troubles that Israel and the world are going to face until he comes back. Because remember, he said, look, I'm leaving. He was at the temple. He has his final interaction with his enemies. He realizes he's been rejected. He acknowledges he's been rejected. And then he's like, I'm leaving. And he's getting out of Dodge. And he's leaving Jerusalem. And as he leaves, they point out the temple. And he says, hey, guys, that temple's not going to last. And then they come to him and they say, well, when's this going to happen? I mean, when's it going to happen? You're leaving? When are you going to come back to the temple and do the kingdom and set it all up the way we thought you were going to? You're the Messiah, right? And he's like, yes, I'm the Messiah, but I'm leaving. And I'm not coming back for an extended period of time. And before I come back, you got to realize things are going to get really, really dark. Things are going to get horrible before they get better. The world is going to go through a terrible time of tribulation before I come back to set up the kingdom of God like I intended to do in this moment. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details because I don't have the time. We can do that some other time, and will, especially if there's an interest in that and kind of exploring some of these details a little bit more. But what Jesus does over the next 2 chapters, and especially in chapter 24, is he ties what he's saying and his teaching on the matter to Old Testament prophecy. He goes back to the book of Daniel. He refers back to some other of the prophets in the Old Testament to basically say the Old Testament got it right. The Messiah is going to come, and when he comes, he's going to set up the kingdom. He says, but I'm not doing that right now. I'm going to go away for a while, and then I am going to come back. And when I come back, I will fulfill the vision that the prophets in the Old Testament foresaw. But that's not happening right now. And in fact, if you read chapter 24, there have been hundreds, maybe thousands of sermons that people have delivered on Matthew 24, and what they try to do is they try to parse every little detail and figure out every little thing and come up with these very detailed chronologies, and this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and they want to, it's like we're trying to put a puzzle together, but we don't have the picture. I know I've used this illustration with you folks before, but if you're trying to put together a 1,000-piece puzzle and you don't have the picture, sometimes you just make pieces fit, whether they actually belong there or not, because you're just desperate to finish this picture that you're working on. And I think the disciples were trying, maybe they were more focused on the details about when and how is it going to happen and what happens first and what happens second and what happens third. They were so fascinated with the details of Jesus' return that they were forgetting something that Jesus clearly thinks is more important than that. More important than obsessing about the details of how it's all going to happen and when it's all going to happen to Jesus is, how am I going to live today in the present, in light of the fact that someday Jesus is returning to set up his Father's kingdom in the future. To Jesus, that's the focus. And the reason I say that is because when you read Matthew 24, it's so vague. It's so vague. There are some concrete details that you can turn to and say, okay, I'm pretty confident that at the end, right before Jesus comes back, this is going to happen. You can go back to Daniel and you can get a few more details and you can sort of paint a picture of what it's sort of going to be like at the end before Jesus returns. But you're never going to get the details you want. You're never going to have all the questions answered that you have. There's always going to be more detail than what Jesus is going to tell. But do you know what he spends? Just look at it, chapters 24 and 25. The majority of his time in these 2 chapters talking about is not parsing all the details, getting all the timeline stuff, making sure our flow charts are perfectly aligned and everything is going to work out so that we can predict what's going to happen and what country it's going to be and where the Antichrist is going to come from and who the 7 kings are and blah, 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 blah. That could be interesting thought process, but that's not where Jesus wants them to focus their attention. He wants them to focus their attention on, I'm coming back. How am I supposed to live today reacting to the fact that Jesus is coming back? And so he's now going to tell a series of stories, a series of parables that are designed to show his disciples how they're supposed to live in a hostile world in the time in between when he leaves them at his death and when he returns to set up his Father's kingdom. Turns out, it's been a long time, hasn't it? It's maybe longer still before Jesus returns. And Jesus is more concerned with how are we going to live for him in the in-between than he is about us having all this knowledge about what's coming right at the end. And I get it. You're curious. I'm super curious. I would love to know. I would love to have that kind of detail about the end of the world and how it's all going to end. But what Jesus seems to be focusing on, and what he tells all kinds of stories about here in chapters 24 at the end and 25, is how are you living now? Like, I'm coming back. Have you thought about the implications of the fact that I'm coming back to your life today? Are you living your life today in such a way that you are ready for me to come back? That seems to be Jesus' priority. That seems to be Jesus' focus. And so he's going to lay out some of these principles. How am I supposed to live today? He's going to lay out some of those in these stories that we have here. And the cool thing is that we live in that in-between time as well. It wasn't just Jesus' original audience that was living in the in-between, his leaving and his coming back. We have been born and we've been saved and we live today in that in-between time. So the lessons he wanted them to focus on, the things he wanted them to be doing in the in-between, are probably very similar, if not exactly the same, as what he wants us to be doing in the in-between. The focus and the values he wants us to have. And so that's what I want to focus on here with a couple minutes I have left, is to take a look at what is it Jesus thought his disciples should be doing in the meantime while they're waiting for his coming. And the first thing I can see, and I encourage you to read a little bit at the end of chapter 24, where he talks about, he says this in verse 43. Or excuse me, verse 42. He says, "Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." How does Jesus want us to live until he returns? Number one, he wants us to anticipate his return. Not have figured out what day it is or what year it is, or all the stuff that's going on with this coronavirus thing. Some of you have been asking me, and I understand why. Does this mean Jesus is coming? Could the rapture be right around the corner? Could the end of the world and the return of Jesus be like right around the corner? And of course it could be. Of course it could be. But the world has gone through crises like this before too. There's been famines. There's been plagues. There's been huge economic upheaval. There's been death and destruction. That's all happened before, and we're still here. But the key question is, are you living today looking for the return of Jesus? Are you aware that he's returning? Or have you just decided, you know what? I got a long life to live, and I'm putting my head down, and I'm just going to keep muddling my way forward. I'm just going to keep focused on the present. Jesus says, I want you to be ready for me to return. Like, I want you to live as if I could come back at any moment. I want you to live as if you don't know, you don't have your present guaranteed to you. You don't know how much time you have. So stay awake. Be ready. Anticipate my return. Something that's really important whenever we feel down and depressed, and I don't know if you've been isolated long enough to start to feel the fingers of depression reaching for your soul yet. I have at different times in my life over the last few weeks. If you're there, can I just encourage you to do something? Anticipate the return of Jesus. Allow your thoughts and your mind to be drawn to the fact that Jesus is coming back. That this darkness we're going through right now is not going to last forever. And even if it gets a lot worse, at the end of the lot worse is the day that we've been waiting for. It's Jesus' return for us. Our hope is not that the curve is flattened and the healthcare industry doesn't crash. Our hope is not that the president figures out how to keep the economy from crashing. Our hopes are not based on things turning out on a certain level here in this earth. Our hope is based on the fact that Jesus is coming back. He's returning. And when he returns, he's going to fix everything that's broken, and he's going to establish his Father's kingdom once and for all. And Jesus is like, I want you to be ready. I want you to be looking for me. I want you to wake up in the morning and say, I wonder if today could be the day. Because that sense of anticipation will change the way you act throughout the day. And that gets me to the second part here. Notice verse 45 and 46 of chapter 24. 45 says, "Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes." So what is the second thing Jesus wants his disciples to do in the meantime between his leaving and his coming back? He's like, you need to do the job I gave you to do. I left you here with a mission. I didn't save you so that you could just wander through life until I come back and fix everything. I left you here with a task to accomplish. And for us, we talk about it all the time. It's making disciples. He left us with the task of making disciples in our families, in our friends groups, in our acquaintances, even in our strangers, even in our enemies. Our job, our goal is to be used by God to make disciples and to use the gifts he's given us to make a difference in the world, to touch people's lives, to make life better for people. We've been left here with a job to do. Jesus says, you know what? It's going to be wonderful if when I come back, you're doing what I left you to do. If you're focused on the mission I gave you, you are going to make, when I show up, that's going to be a wonderful meeting. I'm going to high five you all day and all night, and it's going to be a glorious reunion if you're doing the job I left you to do. So don't get hung up about when I'm coming back. Don't obsess about what date to put on it and what country is going to bring the bad stuff and who, blah, 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 blah. All the stuff we tend to obsess about. Focus on, am I doing the job I'm supposed to be doing right now, right here? Because I want to be doing that job when Jesus comes back. Third thing is the parable of the talents. You remember that parable? A guy's going away, a master, and he gives 3 of his servants. He gives them 1 chunk of money. He gives another one another chunk of money. He gives a third one chunk, and then a fourth one a small amount of money, but it's enough money to at least invest. And he says, okay, guys, I'm going to go. You do this. I'll be back. And 3 of the guys assumed that the money was intended to be invested. And so they invested the money, and they earned more money with the money that their master had given them. And when the master came back after being away, he rewarded them for taking the risk and investing the money and making it bigger, making it fruitful, making it bigger than when he left it. The 4th guy was afraid of losing the little bit that his master had given him, so he dug a hole in the ground and dumped it in there, and so that at least when his master came back, he could hand it to him and say, at least I didn't lose it. And that servant is criticized and punished for his laziness and for his wickedness. That's what the text says. What is Jesus trying to get at here? I think Jesus is telling us that in the in-between, between when he leaves and when he comes back, in that in-between time, I want you to take risks in order to be fruitful. I want you to take risks in order to be fruitful. Every single one of us has been gifted certain opportunities, certain gifts and abilities and talents and finances and backgrounds and DNA and all this stuff that we've been given, that we didn't earn ourselves, we didn't work for. It was just programmed into us from the beginning or from our salvation. And what Jesus is saying is, you got to take all the stuff I gave you, and in the time when I'm gone, in the in-between, put it to work. Do something with it. Develop it. If God has given you a quick mind, you need to sharpen that mind into an instrument that can be used by God to touch other people who need that. If God has given you good, quick fingers to create and build, you need to develop that ability to bless and minister to other people. You've got to take whatever God gives you, and you have to work on it during your lifetime so that when he returns, you can say, God, you gave me X, and I took it, and I invested it, and I worked it, and I'm here to give you X plus Y, which is whatever I've been able to build off of it. And I'm giving it back to you because it was yours all along. Jesus says, take risks. Be fruitful. Don't just dig a hole in the ground, and whatever God gave you, I'm just going to hold on to it and hope I don't lose it. Invest it. Take risks. And you'll be fruitful, and you'll be able to give back to God. Jesus, when he shows up, you'll be able to offer him, hand over to him something to show that his investment was worthwhile. So that's number 3. The last thing, you remember the story that Jesus says here? Look, it says, I'll just read the passage in verse 25. In verse 31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he'll separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he'll place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. And the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Inherit the kingdom. You get to go into the kingdom. Woohoo, this is for you. It's finally here, and I want you to be a part of it. And then they're like, well, what's the basis for being a part of this kingdom? And Jesus says, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you visited me. And they're like, what? When did we do that? Jesus, you weren't even here. You were gone. And he's like, whenever you did it for one of the least of these my followers, these my children, you did it for me. And then he says, enter into the joy of your kingdom. In other words, here's number 4. Your choices have consequences. Your choices have consequences. The choices you make matter. If you make the right choices to invest your life, to stay focused and do the job he's given you to do, to anticipate his return, if you do that, then the results and the rewards are going to be precious and valuable and significant. Your choices matter. But if you don't, if you're one of these people that just kind of coast through life and you don't think your choices matter, so you live selfishly, you live this, then you're also going to face the consequences of those choices as well. And so Jesus gives a warning. He's like, look, your choices matter. I'm walking away. I'm leaving the room. I'm going off to my Father's presence in heaven, and I'm leaving you here on earth with the Holy Spirit. I'm going to give you a certain amount of resources to get this done. But you need to invest yourself. You need to be doing what I called you to do when I return. Because the choices you make matter. The rewards will be great, and so will the punishments, depending on your faithfulness. So that's pretty dark, right? But this is kind of how Jesus' mood has shifted in Holy Week. And now he's shifting to think about, okay, the cross. I'm leaving. I'm going to be gone for now over 2,000 years. I've got to prepare these disciples for life when I'm gone. And the best thing I can do is to encourage them and tell them stories that'll help them to know what I expect from them in the in-between. I expect you to anticipate my return. I expect you to keep doing the job I gave you to do. I expect you to, number 3, take risks and be fruitful. And then I expect you to remember that your choices have consequences. And when I come back, will settle up accounts with you. And I'll reward you like crazy if you've done what's right. And there will also be equal serious punishments if you haven't. And then the rest of the events in chapters 26 into 27 lead to the crucifixion. But that's where I want to leave it for today. Your assignment, of course, is to read chapters 24 and 25 for yourself. You have today and tomorrow to work on this. And ask yourself some tough questions while you're reading chapters 24 and 25. And the tough question is, the big question is, am I ready for Jesus' return or not? Am I ready? In fact, ask Jesus that question. Am I ready, Jesus, for you to return? Have I been living in such a way that if you showed up, I'd be excited to see you and you would be excited to see me? Or would I be nervous or upset about the things I have been neglecting to do for you? Because that's the focus Jesus wanted his disciples to have during this Passion Week. So maybe it's a perspective we would benefit from as well. Okay, a couple of announcements and I'm going to let you out of here. So we're not going to do communion this Sunday. I need a little bit more time to chew on this and discuss it with some of our leaders of our leadership team. Here's the thing. I want to make sure that whatever we do with the communion is something that is honoring to God and it's faithful to the scriptures. And there's just a few questions that I still have about this, and we're going to discuss it and talk about it. I'd appreciate your prayers as I think this through. I want to do what's right. I want to do what's best for our church family. So I'll keep you informed, but definitely not this Sunday. We won't be celebrating communion together, and I'll keep you informed as I meet with the leadership team and talk next week whether or not we'll be celebrating it in maybe one of the weeks that follow in the month of April. Also, too, there's no Holy Week meditation for tomorrow. I'm taking the day to focus on my preparations for Sunday. So we'll not have one of these 4 o'clock gatherings tomorrow. However, I am going to post another song recommendation tonight in the evening, and also another recommendation tomorrow. I've already picked out the songs. I've got all the order. I'm just going to post them, even though I'm not going to be working on a daily update. I'm still going to give you a song to reflect on tomorrow as you continue to figure out how to worship our Lord. And I don't want to let you off the hook about my message on Sunday. I really think that God gave me that message so that I could share it with you, so that you could be thinking about what extravagant gift God might want you to give Jesus this Easter. And I pray that maybe as you think about it, as you listen to these songs, as you hear these daily updates, maybe something is popping into your head that you could do. And if that's the case, do it. If you need accountability, though, to actually do it, feel free to email me, Facebook me. Let me know what it is that you think God is leading you to do, and then I'll keep you accountable on it, and I'll kind of push you on that as well. Let me pray, and then we'll be dismissed for today. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for this opportunity. A difficult couple of passages, a couple of chapters of your word, hard to grapple with, hard to know all the details about your return. But we do know you are going to return, Jesus, and you want us to be ready for you when you get back. So, Father, help us to focus on the job that's right in front of us. Help us to continue to do what you've called us to do, to anticipate your return, take risks, Lord, in order to be fruitful for you. And I pray, God, that you would help us, even in times of coronavirus crises, that we'll be able to be fruitful, love others, take care of one another, be kind. And I ask all these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen. All right, friends, I'll see you on Thursday at 4 o'clock for another Holy Week meditation. May the Lord bless you.